Brad said that you pretty much ready to start chapter 8. So we're going to plunge into chapter 8 with probably several references back to things in chapter 7 and even previous to that. So as always, please feel free to jump right in with a question or a comment as we go through. Hope everyone has a study book. The question 1, you may think is a little bit unusual in the way I worded that, but he starts, verse 1 of chapter 8, starts off, now the point in what we are saying is this. And then he goes on to talk about that. That's interesting to me, the way that's worded. And we've said this before, I'm sure I'll say it again, is whether it's Paul or someone else, I happen to think that the writer of the letter is Paul. Most of what he does in this is follow a logical, rational line of argumentation about the points that he's wanting to make. Some of it is just very straightforward. He said, basically, if this, then this, so forth. Some of it, like from early part of chapter 7 with Melchizedek, is less straightforward, a little bit more oblique, a little bit more abstract. And we talked some about that, the figurative language used in that. But now he begins chapter 8. Obviously, that was not divided into chapters when the author wrote this. But he says, okay, here's the point. So the question I asked is, after all that the writer has set forth in the first 7 chapters, why is the point of verse 1 of chapter 8 so important? What did you have to say about that, somebody? Barry?
I'll take a crack at it.
All right.
It says, he is seated at the throne of the majesty in heavens. And when the Levitical priests and the high priests were serving in the temple, there were no chairs or seats there. Their work was continuous,
Okay.
offering sacrifices. Jesus' work is complete. And
Right.
he is where God is intended him to be, at the right hand of the majesty.
That's right. And we're going to talk about that some, about almost getting into verb tenses here about what he's saying as he begins chapter 8. Anybody else have a thought about Joe?
It's also interesting how he says we have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, how we get, again, this image of priest and king. Because typically you wouldn't see the priest seated, at the throne. But it's showing 2 things. He's in the tabernacle, the true tabernacle, in verse 2, but he's also sitting on the throne. So it's, again, that priest and king contrast.
King and priest. That's a good point. Anybody else have some thoughts on this? You're just getting ready
Well, I'm
to
just thinking, I think what's happening here is that he's been talking about the who, and now he's going to talk about the what.
Okay.
The work. So he's been talking about the individual, now he's going to talk about the work that he does. So he's moving from the man to the mission, as it were.
Okay, that's good. And we're going to get into that some in chapter 8, the mission as far as how it relates to the covenant and what Jesus' role is with respect to that covenant and so forth. Do we not sometimes, if we're hearing someone make an extended speech about something and making a number of different points about various things and so forth, and we're trying to put it all together in our minds as to what is all this about? Do we not sometimes say well, what's your point? And I think the writer here is anticipating that, it seems to me. Anticipating people saying, okay, you've talked about Jesus being, God speaking through Jesus. You've talked about Jesus being superior to the angels. You've talked about Jesus then being made a little lower than the angels, even though he's superior to the angels. And what's involved with that? You've talked about Jesus being superior to Moses. You've talked about Jesus being a son as opposed to being a servant. But then later on you talk about Jesus being a servant. Though he were a son, yet learned he obedience through the things which he suffered. And he's talked about Jesus as the high priest. He's talked about that in the past. He's going to talk about that again. And all these various things, some people might have said, okay, where's he going with this? And I think the simple thing that he says at the big, when he says, after he says, now the point in what we're saying is this: we have such a high priest. We have it right now. Not waiting for it anymore, not looking forward to it one of these days. He talked earlier about the promises. Chapter 7 talked some about promises, other places. He says, we've got that right now. And not only do we have that kind of high priest, where is he? Seated on the throne in heaven. And then he's going to talk about, is this a figure, a shadow of heaven? And the answer, of course, is no. It's no longer a figure or a shadow of anything. It's the real deal. And he's trying to drive home the point, again, to these Hebrews, and the point will be to us as well, is don't waste your time looking for something else. It's here right now. And it's here, and he's going to continue to discuss about the high priest and how Jesus as high priest does certain things. And then he's going to get into the idea of Jesus and his relationship to the covenant, the new covenant. And talk back in chapter 7. And I know Brad covered some of this in chapter 7. Why was there any kind of change of high priest? And if there was a change of high priest, what came along with that? And we won't discuss that all again. I know that was discussed on Sunday. But part of this, like with Melchizedek, is really requires some deep thinking. Talking about an indestructible life, had neither beginning of days nor end of life, and so forth. That, as a matter of fact, he just said in chapter 5, I want to talk to you about this, but you're not quite ready to hear it. And then he comes back to it in chapter 7. Some of it is not really figurative at all. Like what we just said from chapter 7. He says, look, if you're going to have a change of priesthood and have a priest like Melchizedek was, and not like under Levi and the descendants of Aaron, you've got to have a change of law. He says that's just the way it is. And that's just a very logical point that he makes. He makes the same logical kind of point when he talks about Melchizedek and Abraham. Who blessed whom? Who gave tithes to whom? And again, those kind of things, it's very easy to follow. The Melchizedek indestructible life is a little bit harder to follow. But he puts all that together and says, we've got something right now in heaven, someone in heaven who's accomplishing everything that needs to be accomplished. Tim.
Okay, I'll read the book of Hebrews. without thinking how much glory there is in the middle part of the book. Chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And you come to a crescendo in 10. It just gets more and more glorious the more you read. And then I'm reminded of what he said at the very beginning. We must pay much more careful attention to what we've been taught.
Right. Not only did those people to whom he was writing, but us today. Lest at any time we drift away. That's right. Pay careful attention. Because as glorious as all this is, we don't want to be caught up as some people are caught up sometimes, drifting away from that and saying, first to myself and then maybe later to other people, well, the things I used to believe, I'm not so sure about anymore. And the writer here is saying, don't let that happen to you. Do not let that happen to you. Any other comments? Okay, Jesus is a superior high priest because he's a minister of the true tabernacle. And what does that mean? The true tabernacle as opposed to what?
The earthly tabernacle.
Okay. Not true as opposed to false, but the real thing as opposed to when he says, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. That's what tabernacle means, is tent. And that was and under the old law, the Israelites would put it up and take it down, and put it up and take it down. And that was, and God's presence was considered to be there in that tabernacle. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more here in just a minute. The true tent, or the true tabernacle. Any more comments about that? Let's move on. Number 3, why was it necessary, according to verse 3, that Jesus have something to offer? What point is he making?
It's the requirement of every high priest.
Right, that's right. That's the way it is for a high priest. You have to have that. And this one is so basic and so such a fundamental logical argument. People would say, well, of course anybody would know that. But he's using that to make a point here. When he says, for every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus, it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. That's pretty simple, isn't it? But he's going to make a point from that. He said, here's what a high priest does. He offers sacrifices. Now, if Jesus is going to be called a high priest, what's he going to do? And that's going to be this grand point that he's working toward, again, as he keeps talking over and over again about Jesus being a high priest. What's the main function of the high priest?
Stand before God and offer sacrifice.
That's right. Offer sacrifices on behalf of others, and under the old law, on behalf of himself and others. That's what a high priest does. And he's going to show that Jesus has a legitimate claim to being high priest, even though it would be different. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. If he were not where he is. He's in heaven, not on earth. Okay. Question 4. Why would Jesus not be a priest if he were on earth?
He is not a Levite.
Okay, not a Levite. Meaning what?
He cannot possibly fill the role because
That's
he's not
right.
qualified.
That's right. And chapter 7 talked about that some. Verse 4 says, now if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all. That's pretty straightforward, isn't it? So how can he be a priest? Well, he can be a priest because he's left the earth and he's in a much better place to offer the sacrifices than an earthly high priest under the old law. He would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. Now, look back for just a second. I'm sure y'all covered this, but look at back in chapter 7, verse 14. Some of these things in Hebrews, we sometimes have to think, okay, now how does that apply to me today in the 21st century? Okay, but chapter 7, verse 14, I think, in my humble opinion, has some wording that is very, very significant for us in our general Bible study and understanding what God's will is. And what do you think I'm alluding to? From verse 14, if you can read my mind.
God was silent,
Okay.
and we can't.
How does he specifically say that?
He spoke nothing concerning, he was from Judah, which tribe Moses spoke nothing concerning the priesthood.
Okay. All right. So now I'm going to say, what's the point there? Why is that something that might be significant for us today? Moses didn't say anything about priests coming from another tribe, like from Judah. So if he didn't say you can't do it, surely it wouldn't be a problem. He didn't say, I want priests to come from Levi, but I do not want them from Reuben, Simeon, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, and all those others. He just said Levi. And that closed the matter, did it not? So what's the point for us? Go ahead, Reed.
Silence is not license.
All right, that's a good way of putting it. We could go to other passages where talks about don't add to or take away from, whatever. But I think this is just in simple language here is a good example for us to say, Moses, when it says, Moses said nothing about priests coming from Judah. And the writer here clearly is saying, because he didn't say anything about priests coming from Judah, that means you can't do it. You cannot. So there had to be other arrangements made for Jesus as high priest. Isn't that the argument that he's making here? That if he were on earth, he wouldn't be serving as a priest because of the restrictions that are placed in it. I don't want to belabor the point, but I think that's something that's a basic principle of Bible study and of interpretation of the do's and don'ts of Scripture is, as Reed said, silence is not license. And I think it certainly would behoove each one of us to remember that.
We
Right.
need to remember then we can't justify by saying, well, God didn't tell us not to do that.
Right.
That's the point.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. And wouldn't it be great if people in the religious world in general understood that principle? That if God said, when we say, well, he didn't say not to do that, so it must be okay. Well, Scripture doesn't teach us that way. Scripture teaches that silence, well, and you've heard the examples about God told Noah to build an ark. Build it out of gopher wood. But make sure that you don't build it out of pine or oak or sycamore or this or that or the other. Just said build it out of gopher wood. That was the end of the matter right there. And there's going to be many other examples given about the silence of the scriptures. Tim, did you have something you?
Just to add to that, God, we see here, does teach by inference. He states a premise, he states maybe another premise, he expects you to understand what he's saying. Between the lines, figure it out.
That's right.
Now, that's not always easy to do, but here we have what we call a necessary inference.
Right.
All of us can see it, it's clearly communicated what God is trying to infer to us.
There's only one reasonable conclusion. That's the necessary inference that you can come to from this. And everything else is counter to that. That's a good point. Any other comments on that? All right. Question 5. The priests on earth served in a tabernacle that is characterized in verse 5 as only a what? Say it louder.
Copy and shadow.
A copy and a shadow. What's wrong with being a copy or a shadow? Is that a bad thing?
It's not real.
It's not a bad thing. It's just different.
It's just not the original.
Now, it is bad, I use that loosely, because it is inferior. One is inferior, one is superior, and we won't go back through all that again. But when he said, they serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. And a lot of Hebrews, some of it we've already talked about, and we'll continue to talk about as we go through Hebrews. It's a discussion about here's the copy, here's the shadow. Sometimes it's referred to as here's the type. And then the antitype, or the real thing, or the substance, is something different. And again, his message to these Hebrews is, are you going to leave the real thing and go back to something that's just a shadow? Now, and we could talk for a long time about when he talks about the fault that was found with the old covenant and the problems that were associated with that and what that means and what it doesn't mean. But the fact of the matter is, without a whole lot of discussion, is that he's saying, look, we've left the figure and the shadow and the copy, and we're going to the real thing. And that's why when he says, verse 1, now the point in what we're saying is this: we have such a high priest who's seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. We've got that right now. Why would you ever go back to something that's just looking forward to the real thing? This is the real thing that we have here. Joe? Something
that's so unique about Judaism and then ultimately Christianity is that, and one of the primary points of Hebrews is, it's not that what they were doing before the old covenant was wrong or evil, because so many times when new religions pop up in the world, it's like, okay, well, everything else is false, and this is the correct one. But this is unique from many others, because when Christianity comes along, and the point of Hebrews is, okay, the old covenant was good for its time, and it was necessary for its time, but we moved on to something better. But it's not saying that what was previous was false. It just was as it says, a copy. So it wasn't meant to be permanent. Right. It's just one was leading to the other, and had been leading to the other for approximately 1,500 years. And when you go back to chapter 2, where we start about, again, we can see an indication. He's not saying that the old law was a bad thing.
or the way that it came about was a bad thing. When he said in chapter 2, verse 2, for since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution. What's he talking about there? The message delivered by angels. We've talked about this. What's that a reference to?
Bringing the law.
The old law. He says, if it was reliable and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? One, in a way, it's like one was good, but the other is great. And so it's a matter of degree somewhat, and it's a matter of intent. The intent was always, and he uses Melchizedek to talk about that. And in Galatians, again, I'm trying not to step on what Reed's going to be talking to us about.
I was going to say, well, why then the law?
Yeah, absolutely. Chapter 3. Why even have the law? Well, there was a reason for it. It was added because of transgressions. And he talks about the Abraham, and then the law comes 430 years later, and then to lead us to Christ. But it's a matter of degree, always undergirded by intent. God's intent always. He didn't say, well, we're going to do this law under the law of Moses, but wait a minute, that didn't work out so well, so let's go back and try plan B. That's not at all. It was always the intent for it to be that way.
Yeah.
Any other? Yes, sir.
You just look at the text. Verse 5 says, we who serve the copy and the shadow of the heavenly things, as Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle, for God said to him, see that you make all things
Right.
according to the pattern. But now, next verse says, but now it's different. He's going to point them in a different direction. It was of God, is what God
Yeah.
wanted. There was a pattern that they
Yeah.
had to follow and obey, and they could not change that pattern. And so there's nothing bad about it, but it's still a copy and a shadow.
Right.
Something
And
greater.
that's the way it always was going to be. He didn't say to Moses, well, we would set up this tabernacle and have you worship this way and have laws for you to follow. But that's not going to last forever anyway, so let's just not worry about it. That's not at all what he said. He said, you do exactly what I tell you to do and set up a pattern for him to follow. Even though clearly it was not going to last forever. But again, as we're going to learn in Galatians, it was to bring us to Christ. That was always going to be the point. All right, number 6. A discussion of covenants is an important part of chapters 8, 9, and 10. What's involved in the idea of a covenant? Just in your own words. What's that mean?
Contract or agreement.
All right, a contract or an agreement, usually between two parties that come to some agreement, might be put in writing, whatever, and he's going to be talking about that a lot in chapters 8, 9, and 10. And when he says that Jesus look at beginning of verse 6. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent than the old. As a covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. The first covenant, the old covenant, was between whom? Who were the two parties?
The Israelites, the Jewish people.
Nation.
And
God.
God. God and his chosen people, the children of Israel. He said, he doesn't say that was just a bad thing. It just never worked out. It didn't work out because of humans not behaving themselves, And because of the law, we had knowledge of sin, he says. But Jesus mediates a better covenant. And that gets us to question 7. Explain the meaning of the phrase, he is also the mediator of a better covenant. What does that mean? I mean, we know what the words better covenant mean. What does it mean? He's the mediator of a better covenant.
Well, Moses was a foreshadowing of it, and so there had to be someone who stood in the gap between God and the people.
Okay. Isn't that what a mediator does? He officiates between the two parties in any kind of agreement, like a covenant, or some sort of a negotiations or whatever. You officiate in between, and he said that Jesus is the mediator of a better covenant. And as you said, Joe, Moses was a mediator between God and his chosen people. And then the descendants of Aaron as high priests were mediating between, trying to make amends for all the human frailties and faults that people had in offering sacrifices year after year after year. And we're going to be getting into that more as we get especially into chapters 9 and 10 about what the high priest used to have to do. But he said Jesus is the mediator of a better covenant because where is he mediating from? That's maybe not a very good sentence, but
The right hand of God.
that's right. Now, going back to verse 1 again, we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. A minister, the idea of a minister is just one who serves, a servant of some sort. He's serving there, and it just there are different ways of characterizing what he does. He's a minister. He's also a mediator. He's both of those things. He's a mediator as the go-between, as in 1 Timothy 2. There's one mediator between God and man, the man, Christ Jesus. You only need one, but he's the mediator for all, and as a mediator of a better covenant. Question 8. This new covenant was established on better promises. From verses 10 to 12, what are 3 of these promises? Somebody name one of the promises. It's a better promise.
Remembering their sins no more.
Okay, remember their sins no more. Did they remember sins under the old covenant?
He talks about that later, the perpetual sacrifices.
Yeah. Yes, they did.
Reminder.
And we're going to talk about that more again as we get into chapters 9 and 10. There was a remembrance made every year about that. But he said, remember their sins no more. Now this is a quote from where?
Jeremiah 31.
Jeremiah 31, which is a prophecy about what? What's basically Jeremiah 31 through 34 is a prophecy about what?
And they're being exiled to Babylon.
I'm sorry?
They're being exiled to Babylon and then they're returned.
Okay, all right. And he said, this is in the midst of Jeremiah talking about that exile that's coming. So forth. And then he launches into this prophecy about, he said, what's going to happen one of these days?
It's a new covenant.
Yeah, a new covenant. Brand new. It's going to be very different from the way things were in the past. Let's give me 2 more promises real quickly, and then we'll close out.
For all people, not just the Israelites.
That's right. They shall not teach each one his neighbor, each one his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. People that are going to be a part of this new covenant once you're part of that covenant, you don't have to say, okay, I want to tell you about the Lord. That's a part of being a part of the covenant, is knowing about the Lord. Now, the children of Israel, they were born into God's family. When they were growing up, they would have to have someone teach them about who the Lord was and what that was all about. Or their wayward neighbors that were not part of the good remnant, they would have to be taught that. But see, in this new covenant, you will know the Lord. That's a part of being part of the covenant. One more promise. What's another promise that's a better promise? Where are the laws going to be written? On our hearts. And boy, isn't that a lesson for us. If the laws in this new covenant are not written on our hearts, if they're not written on my heart, I've got a problem. Because it's supposed to be written on hearts. Thank you for your good comments.